In this IELTS vocabulary lesson, we're going to look at some key language and vocabulary for the common topic of childhood. It's language that you might read or hear, but it's also language that you can use in the speaking and writing sections of the test. So let's take a look at these 8 key phrases for the topic of childhood. Infant, adolescence, toddler, independent, sibling, upbringing, youth, and adopt. So these are 8 quite high level pieces of vocabulary around the topic of childhood. Let's look at our first piece of vocabulary, which is infant. And here it is, infant. An infant is a very young child, probably between the age of 1 to 4. As an infant, I was very cheeky. My parents said I was quite naughty. So there is a quick example of infant in use, and I've highlighted this word cheeky. It's an adjective to describe usually a child that is a little bit naughty. I remember my time at infant school very clearly. It was a special time in my life. So we can also have an infant school, which is usually again for very young children in the early years of their lives. Okay, infant. And we have sibling, a really great word to discuss or describe whether you have a brother or a sister. A sibling. I have one sibling, a brother called Simon, who is 2 years younger than me. I think it's great for children to have at least one sibling to play with and grow old together. So this extra phrase, grow old, is a common collocation to talk about getting older. We grew old together, or I am growing old. Okay, sibling. So that is a word to discuss or describe a brother or a sister, a sibling. And here we have the word adolescence. It's a time in your life when you are still very young. And here we have, in my adolescence, I was afraid of nothing. As I grew older, I became more careful. And the next example, children develop rapidly during their adolescence. A similar word to sort of infant or childhood, but it's a slightly more advanced way to describe childhood, adolescence. Upbringing. So when you talk about somebody's upbringing, you are talking about how their parents raised them. For example, if a child didn't have a very good upbringing, they might have had a challenging childhood with less support from their family. Let's look at some examples. James had a great upbringing. His family cared for him very much. So in this example, James was looked after very well. His parents cared for him. He had a great upbringing. A good upbringing should give lots of love and support to a child. Okay, there we have some examples for upbringing. And our next piece of vocabulary for childhood is toddler, another way to describe a very young child. And usually toddler is reserved for children who are just starting to try and walk or crawl or move around. They're not quite as still as they once were as very small babies. Toddlers. My friend's baby is still a toddler. She's just started to crawl. So there we have a very small baby that is just beginning to move and crawl independently. The balloon park was packed with toddlers. There's a collection of very small babies, and I'm sure that would be noisy. Okay, our next piece of vocabulary is youth. So you can use this to describe a child. You can call them a youth. It's a noun. There are many youths that hang around the town centre. It's quite intimidating or scary. So there's lots of youths that are hanging around and it's quite scary. As a youth, I played many sports and even won a few trophies. This is actually quite a common phrase, as a youth. It's often used to begin talking about your childhood, so you could try it too. As a youth, I used to play lots of sports as a youth. Next up, we have independent, which means doing something on your own. I didn't really become independent until I was around 13 years old. Children these days are much more independent than before. And finally, we have adopt, which means often parents will, if they can't have children biologically of their own, they will adopt or take care of a baby, usually from a young age. When I was 2 years old, my parents adopted my sister, who was still a tiny baby. When I'm older, I would like to adopt a baby, as I think it's a great thing to do. Okay, so there is some key vocabulary for the topic of childhood. Try and use it in your own speaking and writing, and if it's used well, I'm sure it will help you to score extra marks.